Hey, listeners, before we get into Reformasi Dispatch, just want to tell you about Season 2 of On the Level. We're going back into the field. We're telling the story of the Bandung Zoo battling back from the brink. It was badly neglected for years. An elephant died after he'd been without a vet for a year. Animal welfare activists posted video of decrepit conditions there. The city wanted it shut down. The dying owner, a Sundanese lord, asked his friend to take over. That friend, one of the biggest names in Indonesian zoo circles, said yes. So we followed him in his renovations, the management of the staff, and dealing with the family of aristocrats. We're very pleased. You should check it out. It's Saving Bandung Zoo from On the Level Media. Hope you join us.
This podcast was recorded on 7 March, 9 a.m. Jakarta time. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to Reformasi Dispatch. And just off the back of that timestamp, things probably may have changed. We've got some big events. And I don't know if our listeners will have a look at their calendar, but March 7th is a Sunday. It is 9 a.m. in Jakarta, and we are assembled to talk about what Kevin has told me just off air. Can I say that? Can I say off air? It's told me off air when it's a podcast that we might have just witnessed the most profound political development of certainly Widodo's second term, if not his entire tenure. His chief of staff is now the head of the opposition.
According to the chief of staff.
According to the chief of staff. There's the Party Demokrat, which was the political vehicle of his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Before we get into that, we're going to talk about rolling back some of the investment limitations on alcohol business. And Kevin, why don't you set us up for your interview? This was with James Bryson at HB Capital. You talked at length about some big changes to the tax code for expats.
Right. Yeah, this is a brand new finance minister decree that came out this past week, and it's something that a lot of people have been waiting for close to 5 years now. It's been a very long process, and it's finally come to fruition, and it helps make Indonesia competitive in attracting capital relative to similar economies, especially in the region, specifically with regards to terms for expatriates working in Indonesia, because previously there was a huge tax disincentive for placing an expat in Indonesia. Now there's a slightly smaller disincentive, but the reform is a bit of a half measure. Yeah. So for the interview today, we have James Bryson from HB Capital. He's an investor, and he's a former director of the British Chamber of Commerce. And with Britcham, he had followed this issue very closely and continue to do so. So he's the best person I know to talk about it, and he explains it very carefully. Basically, expats previously faced taxation on their worldwide income, which was problematic if they had investments or properties or income elsewhere in the world. Now they will be taxed only on their income sourced or derived from Indonesia. So that's a big benefit, because previously there was a lot of risks and pitfalls with the system.
One of the scenarios under the old regime, which really caught my eye, was if you were a CEO of a local business, and let's say you sold your primary residence back in the UK or in the US. In Canada and Australia, I know those sales can be capital gains free. You don't pay tax on the capital gains. No such dispensation in Indonesia. You would be on the hook for paying that. And if you don't pay it, you pay. Did I get this right? 200% of the value. If you get caught, 200% if you didn't declare it.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're working in Indonesia and you sell a property back home and use those proceeds to buy a new property, and the tax authorities catch you, in theory, potentially, you could lose both properties, basically, given the size of the fines. So, that hasn't happened in practice, but on paper, the risk exists. And given the unpredictability of a lot of implementation of regulations in Indonesia, that was a deterrent factor for foreigners considering posts in Indonesia. In the past, it hadn't been a problem because it was always difficult for tax authorities to actually find out about those types of transactions in diverse jurisdictions around the world. That all changed, however, circa 2018 with the advent of the automatic exchange of information. That's a protocol from the OECD, which provides for countries to automatically share data about their taxpayers across borders, and everything's automated nowadays, basically. So it's far easier now for tax authorities to know all about transactions in other jurisdictions, and so that's why this change was needed to bring Indonesia into line with its competitors in providing territorial tax exemptions for expatriates.
I'm going to read through some of the jobs that will benefit from this new treatment. Chemists, geologists, biologists, botanists, zoologists, civil engineers, electrical engineers, university professors, systems analysts, multimedia. These are fairly defined, specialized professions, and they seem to be all professions. Actually, if you're say, I don't know, a podcast host, you don't you don't get the benefit of this change.
Well, yeah, podcast hosts are multimedia designers, I think. And that's
you think so?
Jobs listed.
Yeah, that's 2166 multimedia graphic designers. We might. But that's
we're golden.
Square peg in the round pole.
Just got to keep the podcast going.
But it's quite defined. At best, we can call it a step forward.
Yeah, it's a step forward. And so those jobs are listed in an appendix to Finance Minister Decree number 10, 2021. So that's something that can be updated and expanded upon later. It should be a far broader list. It should be a list in scope of which matches that of the revised negative investment list that we talked about last week. Especially, it should include financial services professionals, because basically the whole purpose of this thing is to bring onshore the capital that Indonesia needs. And given the sums involved, foreigners need to be onshore managing those investments, and therefore they need this territorial tax exemption.
Right. It sounds like it's possibly a way of protecting local professional bodies. I don't see, for example, medical doctors on here.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think that probably is a consideration. That's right. A lot of these jobs are the ones where Indonesia is weakest, and the people in those jobs you listed really have no competition at all right now. So a little bit of foreign competition in those areas won't affect them probably. Maybe that was the rationale. The other limitation with this change is that it applies for only 4 years. Whereas Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, they have open-ended territorial tax exemptions for expatriates.
Right. And that's the main thing, right? Indonesia needs to compete with Malaysia, Thailand in order to get the professionals from increasingly China and Japan and South Korea, not just Europe. When people think bule, they don't think foreigners, they think European, but it's the FDIs coming from China and Japan and Singapore, man. So that's and Indonesia is not on its own. It has to compete with its neighbors to get the talent, to get the investment. The investment talent follows the investment, and sort of just segue using the one step forward, two step back, or two step forward, one step back. And another example of this, the DNI. That was another dramatic do not invest list. That was another dramatic development. You were stunned at the surprised inclusion of alcohol. That was open to 100% investment. And that would have shaken the Heineken and Carlsberg, I think. They're sort of grandfathered into making local brews here. But that got... that got frowned on. That was rolled back, dumped on from a great height.
That's right. And it was only a relatively minor part of the revision of the negative investment list, or the DNI decree from the president last week. And because it applied only in 4 provinces that are majority non-Muslim: Bali, North Sulawesi, East Nusa Tenggara, and Papua. But nonetheless, as we talked about, it was a bold reform. That business swung from 0% to 100% in terms of permissible foreign ownership in those 4 provinces at least. But right away, Islamic organizations protested, and they presented the president with a united front. So you had Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, and the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, MUI, all together. Typically, they're each other's worst rivals, but in this case, they banded together, and so they prevailed upon the president to rescind the 3 line items in the appendix to the decree about the business in the 4 provinces. It's also worth noting that the Papua province authorities also wanted it rescinded. They are against alcohol production in their province. And it's also worth noting that this is just for foreign ownership of alcohol production. Indonesian companies can produce alcohol with the right permits anywhere they want, and they do.
Right. What was the problem as they see it? Was it just sort of these images of foreign money producing more alcohol in a majority Muslim country? Was it the optics of it didn't sit right with them? What was the problem?
Right. Yeah. It violates a tenet of political Islam, basically, or policymaking inspired by Islamic principles.
Right. Okay. And you put, foreign investors and alcohol together in a sentence, it usually doesn't come out very well. Right. Okay. All right. So 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we have potentially a giant leap backward in terms of political meddling of the sort. Now, I'm trying to imagine the chief of staff in the U.S., Rob Klein, right? It's Ron Klein or Rob? It's Ron Klein, right? Biden's chief of staff. And he defects to take over the head of the Republican Party with the I don't know if this is a parallel, but he has the backing of the Justice Department, and this of course would put the Republican Party in disarray, more so maybe than it is right now. But there's something similar has happened here. The chief of staff, Moeldoko, says he is now the head of the opposition party, one of the only main parties is not in the governing coalition, but also happens to be the political vehicle of his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Really? Is Moeldoko the head of the opposition now? And I mean, I'm having trouble understanding how that could possibly happen. And how it could end. what are they driving at?
It's there had not been a lot of political developments and dynamics in Indonesia over the past year or so, and now in one fell swoop, there's extremely rancorous, scurrilous politics happening, and it's become very ugly, and it's really quite out of the blue because this all just cropped up within the last 3 or 4 weeks. We talked about Partai Berkarya in a previous episode of the podcast
Tommy
series.
Suharto,
yeah, and that was sort of a very fringe figure. Tommy Suharto, the youngest son of the dictator, lost his party to a renegade Congress that cropped up out of the blue and claimed legitimacy and replaced Tommy with Mukti Purwo Pranjono, who was a former Special Forces commander. And then the law minister, Yasona Lawli from PDI Perjuangan, promptly came out, this was in August 2020, and recognized Mukti as the rightful chair, despite very dubious procedures in this renegade Congress in Partai Berkarya.
And that's right?
Yeah.
So the law minister is a Jokowi appointee, and he can decide the machinations inside the party. Okay, all right.
Yeah, he has that authority. That's what the law minister does. He decides, this faction is legitimate, that faction is not. there's an element of trust that the minister will make those decisions with a basis in fact. But in any event, there's the possibility of appealing that to the courts, and that's what Tommy did, and then that's a long process. So the first of probably 3 or 4 stages, Tommy won last month. So this is suddenly playing out again, but on a far more important scale because it pertains to the largest opposition party, really one of only 2 opposition parties at present. Udiono's Partai Demokrat, and it raises all sorts of ugly kind of prospects for what this means more fundamentally for the longer term.
What does it mean?
Yeah, well,
it cannot be good. Just to sort of backtrack, Jokowi has a bit of a history of either he either tolerates fiddling with other parties or standing by as the Constitution is meddled with. There was he most famously brought in Prabowo Subianto, his twice opponent, into his governing coalition, and Gerindra is now sort of co-opted. He seemed to permit a constitutional court challenge to term limits. Mm-hmm. There was a challenge to see if Joseph Kalla could serve a 3rd term. He didn't hit that on the head. He doesn't mind playing fast and loose with the body politic, does he? He doesn't. Not an institutionalist, really. At least not a political institution at all. He's about putting together teams.
Right. And, it's interesting to think about the historical context. Suharto, for 32 years, was the mastermind of co-optation. And when that failed, resorting to strong-arm tactics and underhanded, unscrupulous, ruthless measures. Now, Moeldoko is a former chief of the military, which was one of the 3 main pillars of the Suharto regime. And, there's some similarities in his operating style. And going back now to probably 2016, it's possible to link up a series of events that have these types of overtones. Starting with 2016, there was a fairly minor development, but it's telling. Another small party, PKPI, was controversially taken over by Hendro Priyono, who was a former intelligence chief and a Suharto-era general who had meddled in party developments as early as 1993 when he was a 1-star general in military intel, and he helped Megawati gain control of PDI, and that enabled her to eventually become president, basically. So Hendro Priyono took over PKPI in 2016, ousting a figure who had been hostile to the administration. That was Isra Nur, the East Kalimantan governor. And then a similar thing happened again in 2018 with Perindo, the party of Haritano Sudibyo, the business partner of Donald Trump in Indonesia. He was basically coerced into supporting the administration using a tax crime threat of investigation.
And then that went away, amazingly.
Yeah. So as soon as he decided to switch from the opposition to pro-government, then the tax case that the AGO, the Attorney General's office, had been hanging over his head went away, and Haritano Sudibyo's daughter received a position as Vice Minister of Tourism in 2019.
Which is a good gig if you want to do some travel, go on some junkets. It's nice, right?
Yeah, before the tourism sector died. Yeah.
Question for you. Haritano Sudibyo is Indonesia's richest man, right?
No, not even close. Yeah, but he's rich, definitely rich. Yeah, that's the Hartonos who owned Jarum cigarettes and BCA, the Hartono brothers. Yeah,
right. Okay,
sorry. They're world class.
Moving on then. So where do things stand now? Moeldoko says he's in charge, but there are claims to the contrary.
This renegade Congress or Extraordinary Party Congress, known as a KLB, is really not legitimate by any stretch of the imagination. The claims to legitimacy are laughable or farcical. It took place on 5 March in Deli Serdang in North Sumatra in a resort, and Moeldoko appeared there in person. So during the day on Friday, it seemed as if he was ignoring it, and he had made a comment about the fact that the participants in this renegade Congress had nominated him for party chair. And in fact, in the weeks prior, he had basically been denying that he had any designs on meddling with Partai Demokrat. But then all of a sudden, lo and behold, in the afternoon of that day, he flew up to North Sumatra and made an appearance at this Congress and accepted the election as the supposed chair of Partai Demokrat, replacing Agus Yudhoyono, the elder son of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. And so that all happened Friday. And now the president still has made no comment about this. The coordinating minister for politics and legal affairs, that's Mahfud Mahmudin, has not really commented. And next it's going to be up to the law minister whether he recognizes this KLB outcome as legitimate.
Now, just to check, Moeldoko hasn't defected. This isn't as a result of there being some rift with him and the government. He is still very much a Jokowi man.
Right. So the purpose, ostensibly is immediately anyway, is to bring Partai Demokrat on board onto the pro-government alliance. So then that raises the question of what are they aiming at here? Because the pro-government alliance already accounts for 72% of parliament, and there's only 3 other parties of the 9 in parliament that are outside the alliance. One of them, the National Mandate Party, or PAN, is very sympathetic to Widodo. So if you actually count that, then they're actually at 82% already. And Democrat and the other one is the Islamic Justice Welfare Party, PKS, together have about 18% of seats, about half and half roughly. So, they don't need those extra seats to govern by any means. So then that raises the question of, some people are suspecting that Moeldoko wants to use Democrat to get a nomination for president in 2024, but that's nonsense because, his poll rating is approximately 0. And anyway, by taking over Partai Demokrat, that party, if it were legitimately recognized, would wither in the election and it would be unable to nominate anybody. So that's not the explanation. So that leads us then to Widodo being president for life is the question that inevitably will come about, because this maneuver does make sense if there is a very diabolical sort of scheme to do away with term limits for the presidency.
Wait a minute. So how could that work? Why would he need the support of yet another party in order to make that happen? Oh, wait, let me think. There's probably some sort of override in the Constitution, right? That you can change the Constitution if you have X. Oh. So does that add up?
Yeah, and Democrat seats could be key for that because basically an amendment to the Constitution to do away with the 2-term limit for the president would require an amendment process in the People's Consultative Assembly, the NPR, which consists of 2 entities: Parliament with 575 seats in the NPR, and the other one is the almost always totally irrelevant Regional Representatives Assembly, or DPD, which has virtually no power. But it does consist of 132 members directly elected, 4 from each of the provinces. So structured like the U.S. Senate, but devoid of power, except when it comes to amending the Constitution, in which case they have a say. So when the NPR convenes, a simple majority can amend the Constitution. However, in order to convene, they have to have 2/3 of the NPR physically present. Therefore, if you have 1/3 of the NPR, you can block the assembly to amend the Constitution. So,
so this is, the NPR is comprised of 2 bodies. So there's the House of Representatives, and there's this other sort of regional representative body that is almost irrelevant except in constitutional cases. That body has to have a 2/3 quorum in order to.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, has to have.
Yeah,
you have to have
you got it.
2/3 agreement. Okay, 2/3 quorum at least to even consider changing the Constitution. Do you also need a 2/3 majority to pass the changes?
Now, once you get the quorum, you could pass the changes with a simple majority.
I see. Okay, so that gets us to, that must be comfortably at 2/3 if he's got already 72% plus the Party Democrat, or no?
Yeah, if you can enlist Partai Demokrat, yes. Couple problems here. One is, the DPD is almost all independent. Some of those members are party members, but even they are not put in place by their parties. They're elected directly by their constituents. So no one in the DPD really has to listen to the president on this matter. So most of those 132 would probably not buy into this. Therefore, you need almost all of the parliamentary parties behind it. And Widodo has an alliance anyway that consists of 72% or 82% with PAN. With Democrat, that would bring it up to 92%, and that puts him just within range of overcoming that 2/3 quorum rule to amend the Constitution. So that's all on paper. Then there's the larger issue of the political consequences and fallout for all these parties if they were to sign on to something like that. So
it would be spectacularly unpopular.
It's spectacularly unpopular. That's right. And for those involved, and for those that resist, i.e., the Islamic PKS, spectacularly popular for them. Yeah.
Right. So they could say that we're fighting for freedom and democracy against the secularists.
Yeah. So it could get really messy really fast.
Right. If it isn't already. What kind of backing do you think Jokowi is giving that? I mean, we should say that this is all supposition. This is not based on any firm reporting or anyone saying as much. It's just sort of putting some numbers together and coming up with a plausible reason. Right. What kind of backing do you think this would have for Jokowi? What would he be doing?
Right. This, first of all, it would be very short-sighted because merely attempting to do away with term limits would really hurt his popularity. And then he would have to win a presidential election against Prabowo, probably. And Prabowo would then have a huge advantage, which, of course, raises the question of whether Garindra would back such a maneuver by Widodo. So in order for this to work, you would have to do away with term limits and also block out any presidential competition in 2024. So it would really have to be an extreme scenario. In terms of where he stands on this, he's been very coy. There have been moments of speculation about this scenario in the past, especially in late 2019. And on one or two occasions over the past couple of years, Widodo has reacted to such speculation by saying that those who are proposing extending his term are hurting him. Okay, so he said, don't talk about that because by talking about that, you're hurting me. He could have said, don't talk about that because it's not going to happen because the Constitution prevents it and I'm not going to do it and I'm serving only 2 terms and then I'm leaving office. He could have said that, but he didn't.
Right. I want to go back to exporting, furniture. I want to go home. I've done enough. But no, he didn't say that. I thought it was the comment of that is a slap in my face, and I took that as meaning that you are denigrating my legacy. My whole life has been about democracy and reform, and this would be besmirching my reputation. Don't mention me in term limits again.
Yeah. Okay. So right. Yeah. That's what it was. It was a slap in the face. But so it's up for interpretation, though, because he refrained from saying, I will step down, which he could have just as easily have said.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. And 2024, I will be done with public life and I will go home. and there will be somebody else. And he could have used the moment as saying, and this is what has to happen. This is all part of the deal. You come in, you get elected, and then you leave. The whole part of democracy.
Yeah, and this is all doubly strange because there's no real urgency to extending Widodo's tenure. It's not as if the Taliban will take over the country without him. It's not that scenario is not plausible in Indonesia. There's no real urgent exigency. In fact, on the contrary, you've got Ganjar Pranowo from his own same party, PDIP, a reputable, experienced head of the country's third largest province, ranked number 2 in the polls, and as we discussed last time, within reach of Prabowo. So the only reason to try to prolong Widodo's tenure beyond his constitutional limits would be to preserve the privilege and positions of the people around Widodo.
And they might be the ones that are driving this sort of harebrained scheme. It may not necessarily be, how'd you say it? Like if there's, you told me again, also off air, that if there's a cock up, if somebody's made a mistake, if there's a chance that somebody's made a mistake, then that's probably what's happened. It wasn't part of some sort of Machiavellian maneuvering. It wasn't, somebody is trying to grab power because they think it's theirs for the taking, and will think about the consequences later. It may not be the smartest plan, but it's their plan, and it gets them closer to the goal of more power for fewer people.
And it's sort of this excessive brazenness, which Trump in the U.S. has exemplified, and that is the kind of attitude that seems to be inspiring Moeldoko in this case. Just forge ahead, make outrageous claims, and perpetrate this alternative reality of a legitimate renegade Congress, and see how things shake out.
But if you're Moeldoko, you would do something like this. If you see the clock ticking down, there's a sunset to your time in power coming. It's on the horizon and getting closer. You're going to do what it takes to maintain your position.
Yeah, cool. I mean, it's still an extreme gamble because this is it's possible to perpetrate illegal activity at some stage here at the rate things are unfolding. So there's risks, but it's a big indicator is going to be whether the president really somehow indicates his backing for Moeldoko, or whether the president sacks Moeldoko.
Right. So that's for international investors, for listeners to the pod. What do they have to be looking for next? How seriously should they be taking this, or is this something to put on the radar and watch for now?
Yeah, there's a few things. So there's some signposts to look for, and some scenarios to consider. You can kind of conceive of a matrix with on one end of the spectrum you have Moeldoko staying in the cabinet, and the law minister acknowledging the KLB as legitimate. That's sort of the worst extreme, because then the political conditions of the country will really be up in the air. The other extreme is that Moeldoko leaves the cabinet and the law minister rejects the KLB, in which case things will return to normal, or some combination of those two extremes. So some signposts to look for, or whether Moeldoko leaves the cabinet, how the law minister treats the KLB, and then legal cases or law court decisions that would come out, potentially challenging the law minister in future. And in between time, an interesting thing to look at is Suryo Paloh, the founder and chair of the National Democrat Party, or NASDEM. So that's an important party. It's one of the major constituents of the pro-government alliance. Paloh has usually been very loyal to Widodo, although he wavered a little bit last month when Widodo decided to postpone regional head elections. Paloh was reluctant to come on board, but he did finally. Just a few hours ago, he came out and said that this situation with the Partai Demokrat KLB is alarming, quote unquote, because from where he sits, if Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono can suddenly lose his party overnight, Suryo Paulo could suddenly lose his party overnight as well. So
Exactly.
Widodo is at risk of alienating some of his key allies.
Right. Seems like a desperate move. Have you ever met Moeldoko?
No.
I have.
Oh.
You get the feeling he knows where the bodies are. He's got that feeling.
He was famous for there was a sort of a mini scandal surrounding wristwatches when he became military chief. He was caught wearing a very expensive watch, and journalists confronted him about it and asked how he possibly could have afforded this watch, which was worth about $50,000 based on his salary as an army officer. And he insisted that it was fake. And to prove the point, he took it off his wrist and hurled it against the marble floor in order to break it and prove that it was fake. And it was totally unscathed. That kind of backfired.
Yeah, salaries are pretty low in the government. Actually, I think the president only makes something in the order of $35,000 US.
Yeah,
on
that's
paper.
right. Yeah,
it's not very much.
They have nice operating funds that have no strings attached whatsoever. But yes, the salaries are very low.
And for more on that, listen to our pod on bureaucratic reform.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to watch this space, Kevin.
Yeah, okay.
And coming up, James Bryson of HB Capital.
Today we're joined by James Bryson, director of HB Capital, a regulated investment firm in Jakarta. He had been a director of BritCham when the issue of territorial taxation for expatriates arose initially. So he's been able to follow this issue closely, and he's here to explain some of the ins and outs. James, thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Pleasure, Kevin.
Right. So some people might say that territorial taxation for expatriates is basically a tax break for a special interest group. But we've talked about this in the past, and we've talked about how this is really about economic growth. This is about competing for capital that Indonesia needs. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's correct. I think it's worth putting this in context. We know the omnibus law has passed recently, and the implementing regulations have now emerged. And the background to this is really that Indonesia and the government is trying to and needs to attract foreign direct investment, which is relatively low as a percentage of GDP, and also foreign expertise. And this is all part of that effort. There has been seen a disincentive for some firms perhaps to invest and send expertise here because of the tax regime, which is an outlier relative to the competition in Southeast Asia and emerging markets generally. So this, I think you could call it a step in the right direction. But as you've alluded to, it does apply only to a certain number of categories, and perhaps it's less of an improvement than might have been hoped for.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. Well, let's get to the bottom of that. The tax regime. What has Indonesia had, and what does it have now?
Well, historically, Indonesia had a worldwide taxation system based on residence, and what it's now changed to is for certain groups, i.e. 25 special skill groups of expatriates, is a territorial system. And the difference is that in the old system, all tax residents of Indonesia were subject to tax on their worldwide income. And the difference now is that for those 25 groups of expatriates, they will be subject to taxation on Indonesia-sourced income. So income derived from either home country or third countries will not be subject to taxation. So that is a direct incentive to bring certain skills to Indonesia. And it is in line with several of the other markets in Southeast Asia. If we look at the direct competitors for foreign direct investment and foreign expertise, such as Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, etc., they have a mixture of either tax rate based on residence or territorial, but they all have exemptions. But their exemptions are somewhat wider ranging than compared to Indonesia, i.e. it applies to all expatriates, just not certain groups.
Okay. Yeah, I want to follow up on that. But first, can you explain how this became problematic and when and why?
Well, the origin of these changes is relating to the OECD-driven automatic exchange of information. And this meant that, in simple terms, wherever you are in the world now, a tax regime will be able to follow up on what you're doing. And so this led to the tax amnesty being put in place by Indonesia between mid-2016 and first quarter 2017. And the intention of that was to encourage all taxpayers, whether Indonesian or expatriate, but mainly aimed at the Indonesian taxpayers, to declare income, whether it was onshore or offshore, that had not been declared previously. And that kind of closed the net on this kind of loophole, which was a positive thing. It achieved about $10 billion in penalties. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to the massive repatriation of assets that was hoped for because of the penalty structure, which didn't act as a great enough incentive to do that. But it was seen as a success. Caught up in that were expatriates who weren't really the target, but because of the way the Indonesian tax law was written, found themselves part of it. And that meant that compared to those other countries in Southeast Asia and Asia and emerging markets generally, expatriates in Indonesia were in a personal tax situation, which was substantially disadvantageous compared to those other markets. So all of those other markets pretty much have a system where, regardless of the tax structure, expatriates are only taxed on income sourced in those countries, regardless of what sector they're working in. So that was the origin to it. And that then led to lobbying on behalf of companies who obviously want to increase investment in Indonesia. And in order to do that, many of them would want to bring some expertise to start a project. That's very normal in any country. And encouraging foreign expertise to come to Indonesia when the comparisons with alternative neighbors and investment destinations are more attractive is not easy. And that was the origin of this. So it's been in the making for quite some time. And effectively what Indonesia has done has moved in the direction of countries like North Asia, Japan, China, South Korea, who have a broadly similar system where effectively there's a grace period for the first X number of years when an expatriate arrives in the country.
Okay. And these are economies, well, not in the case of Japan so much, but with China and South Korea and Taiwan, Indonesia is competing essentially for capital inflows. So this is an important factor.
For sure. I mean, actually, in more recent years, they're probably competing less with those countries than trying to attract investment from them. So obviously, China is a very large investor in Indonesia, and so is Japan, and so is Korea. I would say in terms of FDI destination, the competitors are more those in Southeast Asia, so Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines. So these are the countries where, factories or businesses that have been relocating from China and Vietnam as well, those are the countries they're looking at as alternative destinations. And so those are who we have to compete with.
Okay. Now, can you paint a picture of a sort of a prototypical kind of expatriate executive in a FDI project and kind of the implications of the different tax regimes when they're thinking about which one of these countries to choose as their destination, if they own property or shares or a retirement account in a jurisdiction such as the UK, what types of costs or risks would they have faced prior to this change that came out?
Well, if a senior executive is coming to help manage or start a project for a large company, obviously by definition that's someone who has been working for a number of years, reasonably senior. Let's say has family, has some property, has investments, and most likely some of those at least are going to be in the home country. If it's property, more than likely there is a property in the home country. If that person was from the UK, for example, and is looking at the countries in Southeast Asia, I guess the big difference is if we look at what you might call the kind of the big ticket items. If, for example, a UK citizen was to sell their primary residence in the UK, there is no capital gains tax, and in the UK, stamp duty is paid by the buyer. So basically, there would be no tax implication for doing that. Now, if that same executive did that, having started work in Indonesia, once a tax resident there, any income from the sale of that property in the UK would be regarded by the Indonesian tax department as marginal personal income. So effectively, it would be taxed at whatever their higher tax rate is, probably 30%. So that is a very substantial tax implication just on one item, and obviously that you could replicate that across a number of other areas. So in those other countries that I mentioned within Southeast Asia, for example, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, in all of those countries, that would not be the case. And so there are very significant implications for a senior executive choosing to come here, and unless, of course, a company, the employer, is prepared to cover that tax exposure. But obviously, even prior to the COVID pandemic, that was less and less frequent. And for sure now, very few companies would consider doing something like that.
And let's hypothetically say that that person in question there got some bad tax advice and didn't realize that they needed to report the sale of that UK property to the Indonesian authorities. What could the penalties range up to on that in that scenario?
I believe, and I'd obviously tax experts would correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe if something is not declared and is subsequently found to have been not paid when it should have been, ultimately, I think the maximum penalty is 200% of the tax subject, of the tax exposure. So I mean, it would be very, very, very significant. And as we know, the process of getting to there probably involves, complicated administrative time and effort domestically in terms of perhaps contesting it, which could be, very considerable for both, the company and the employer, company and employee. It's potentially, very significant indeed.
Yeah, it's daunting. It's a daunting risk for any expatriate to consider before they accept a post in Indonesia. And it's not just the senior or highest paid executives, is it? It filters right down all the way through into all sorts of different roles that foreigners play in Indonesia, whether it's technicians in factories or engineers. What's the scope of this?
Well, yes, I mean, it applies to anybody. And I think it's fair to say that, most companies that wish to send expatriates to Indonesia will be sending people who are reasonably senior. I mean, obviously, every company that operates here would prefer to use Indonesian employees. Obviously, it just makes good business sense to use employees from the domestic country if you can. There are skill gaps. The government has recognized that. Indonesia's human capital development is an area of great focus, or will be over the next 10 years by necessity, because it lags in many sectors. And so, roughly speaking, there are relatively few very junior expatriates that come here. I think, roughly speaking, out of the, say, 95,000 odd expatriate workers here at the moment, roughly 30,000 of those would be so-called professionals. Another 30,000 would be a mixture of consultants, board members, and advisors, and then 21,000, I think, roughly managers. So, we're talking about, in every case, people who have probably fairly significant experience. And so, there's an exposure to all of these, which is why it makes it slightly unfortunate that the way the new kind of regulation has been written is that the territorial tax access will only be applicable to 25 special skills. And one would have thought intuitively that given the good work that has been done by kind of reversing the negative list and opening up many, many sectors to foreign ownership, that that really should be matched or mapped to in the case of this. But that hasn't been it. So this measure has been in the right direction, but not nearly as broad-ranging as the opening up of ownership restrictions.
Right. Yeah. The finance minister decree that came out this week, PMK 18, extends territorial tax benefits for expats, but only in 25 positions, which are mostly engineers, technicians, designers, and software programmers or multimedia designers. So that's how big of a disappointment is that, would you say?
I think it's quite significant. I mean, as I say, this is a step in the right direction, but it really wouldn't have been detrimental in any way to Indonesia's tax receipts in the big picture to open this up to all sectors and thereby be comparable to pretty much every neighbor in Southeast Asia, which is doing that already. So I think it's as I say, a step in the right direction, but it's a missed opportunity to have done something a little bolder. Which, as we know, in terms of ease of doing business, in terms of global competitive rankings, Indonesia has worked hard to improve and has done so, but it's still got quite some way to go, and this would have helped. It's worth bearing in mind that would not be, panacea for all of the issues. There are clearly other issues which the omnibus law and this don't address or solve immediately, such as foreign investors' concerns over legal system, corruption, sort of terms of shortages of human capital. So there are many issues to deal with, but this would have been, I think, in some people's view, quite an easy win.
Well, maybe it's the kind of thing that's relatively easy to amend or adjust down the road, because those 25 job roles are just listed in an appendix to the decree itself. So, we can. The other issue in the decree is that this benefit applies for a period of 4 years, and is that almost in line with the standard elsewhere?
It's similar to the North Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, who have a kind of grace period for new expatriates, which I think in most cases, in all three cases, is up to 5 years. But in terms of the ones I mentioned earlier that really one should regard as the kind of direct competitors for FDI and foreign expertise in Southeast Asia, no, none of them have a time limit. It's all open-ended. So again, I think a 4-year period, I'm not sure what the justification for limiting it is, but I think it would have been, a relatively straightforward move to put it in line with pretty much all the other, in fact, all the other countries in Southeast Asia.
Baby steps, maybe.
Yeah, and I think as we know, all of those who've been here for sort of some time, that there is an issue in terms of the perception of the number of foreign workers here. It's plus or minus 100,000, but as a percentage of the workforce, that is probably lower than anywhere in Asia and one of the lowest in emerging markets. So there are relatively few actually present here.
Yeah, and it's quite difficult to get work permits still. So in a way, this is putting the cart in front of the horse, because these tax benefits apply for expatriates who lots of times can't get the work permit in the first place. So there's definitely other reforms still needed, huh?
Yeah, true. I mean, that is, to be fair, I think that there have also been great improvements in that, and a fair amount of that process has gone online, which has improved it. It's still not easy; it still needs to improve. But I think the Ministry of Manpower, Ministry of Immigration have actually been working to improve that. Obviously, COVID hasn't helped, but I think there have been steps in the right direction there.
Okay. All right, good. Well, James Bryson from HB Capital, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. And be aware we're going to call on you again in future.
Very welcome. Good to speak to you, Kevin.
Okay. Thanks, James.
And that's the program. Thanks to James Bryson of HP Capital. For a free trial of Kevin's Reformasi Weekly report, go to reformasi.info. As always, our producer is Stephen Handoko, music by Blue Dot Sessions. You can reach us on Instagram at onthelevel_media. And if you like us, please subscribe and rate us. This podcast is a production of On the Level Media. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.